But the Tuskegee Airmen, and all of their values and perseverance, simply took the broken airplanes apart, found enough good pieces to make good airplanes, and for every 5 airplanes that weren't flyable, they were able to make one that could. The Tuskegee Airmen were also training to fly bombers, but in order to make them look incompetent, they were stationed at bases that had 1/7 the land area needed for bombers, that had 1/5 the gasoline supply needed for bombers, and had fewer runways and the worst weather for their training. When Washington, D.C. inquired how they were coming along, the intent was to show that they can't fly these airplanes either. In some of the bases where the Tuskegee Airmen were stationed, they were not allowed in the restaurants or the movie theaters or the laundromats. However, we just want to remind us who he is, that's all. Although the Tuskegee Airmen were not allowed in restaurants and they were not allowed in the movie theaters, white officers took captured German prisoners into these movie theaters, into the laundromats, into the restaurants as means of recreation. The United States Army Air Corps was giving more rights and privileges to its captured enemy than to the Tuskegee Airmen. Many of the bases had sunset laws in the nearby towns where Tuskegee Airmen had to be off the street by dark. And they were not allowed to enter the officers' club on the base, even though they were officers. Getting together to protest this, 101 Tuskegee Airmen wanting to buy a Coke over a period of a few days entered the officers' club. 101 were arrested, charged with Article 64, failure to obey a commanding officers during time of war, punishable by death. They were locked up for 30 days and guarded with guard dogs and barbed wire. They were forgiven for this horrible crime of wanting to buy a Coke by President Clinton in 1995 at a ceremony in Atlanta, Georgia. The Tuskegee Airmen were not discouraged by all these obstacles that were deliberately placed in their way. For their definition of an obstacle was not a barrier that obstructs their goals, but an opportunity for growth, a challenge to enrich their self-confidence, and an opportunity to master new skills. The Tuskegee Airmen never gave up. They had an 11th commandment: we will not quit. They succeeded even though many of their supervisors wanted them to fail. They performed excellent work even though they were often given inferior equipment and little support. They completed their tasks even though they were treated unfairly and discriminated against. Despite unreasonable standards, restricted rights, limited privileges, the Tuskegee Airmen succeeded beyond all understanding with unprecedented achievements, still unmatched by the military today. Their ability to accomplish nearly impossible tasks while operating in an environment of extreme duress is a talent that must be passed on to others, and that's why we are here today. Their knowledge of how to defeat their enemy while maintaining their enemy's dignity is a skill that must be preserved for future generations. On March 29, 2007, Senator Carl Levin stated under the rotunda at the White House while giving the gold medal to the Tuskegee Airmen, he said the Tuskegee Airmen loved their country even though that love was not returned. They believed, despite the bigotry, this was a nation worth fighting for, and thank God they did. The Tuskegee Airmen were given flight missions so far away they would run out of gas before they got back home. They were told to simply put their plane down wherever they could, and that would have been over the Austrian Alps. They were sent to areas in northern Africa where the war was over. In this area, there was no enemy. So how could they shoot down enemy aircraft? This was done on purpose as well, so reports would be sent into Washington. They've been here 3 months, and no enemy has been shot down. When the Tuskegee Airmen's endurance was questioned, their reply was to endure. When the Tuskegee Airmen's reliability was scrutinized, they answered with dependability and trust. They knew that creating less than excellent work for those believing them incompetent would only prove their critics correct. The war was over. They had completed remarkable tasks. However, the United States knew nothing about them. The United States was still segregated, and so was the military. And as they arrived home on the ship in New York, they proudly walked down the gangplank, wanting others to know what they had done for this country and how they had shown that blacks and whites were equal. They were greeted with a sign at the bottom of the gangplank, whites to the right, blacks to the left. The whites went on to ticker tape parades in New York City and a hero's welcome. The blacks went back to Tuskegee Airmen on a train, and while on that train, 2 Tuskegee Airmen were asked to give up their seats, not for white officers, but for German prisoners. The military was still fully segregated. There are no black pilots. There are no black mechanics. The records of the Tuskegee Airmen were locked up and sequestered for 25 years. Many of the airmen did not tell their children what they'd done during the war, because many of the children went to school bragging about my daddy who was a pilot, my daddy who was an air traffic controller or an armament bombardier engineer. And the children were beat up by their peers for lying and sent home by the teachers for lying. There are no black pilots. There are no black bombardiers. We honor the Tuskegee Airmen with parades and newspaper stories and medals and magazine articles. We're missing the point. We honor them, but we fail to see how they have honored us. We fail to see how their legacy of values, which is on every place in this room at your seats, is left for us to guide us into the future. We fail to see how their values and problem-solving abilities and the peaceful answers to so many of our problems in our government, in our schools, in our families. We need to model ourselves after them by embracing their values into our character. We need to ingrain into our youth Tuskegee conflict resolution skills so our children can become the nation's leaders of tomorrow. With this in mind, if you model yourself after the Tuskegee Airmen, you will often fail, as we all do. But instead of being discouraged, you will consider each failure as a successful completion of a stepping stone toward a goal. When you model yourself after the Tuskegee Airmen, you will not run from or avoid fear, for you will know that fear is the only opportunity you will ever have to show courage. When you model yourselves after the Tuskegee Airmen, you will promote positive change in others, never by criticism, but only through your examples of excellence for others to follow. You will never allow the negative conduct of another to influence your behavior. And when you model your values after the Tuskegee Airmen,